The whistle of the Union Pacific train was a lonely cry across the vast, unforgiving plains of the Montana Territory. For Juliet Miller, huddled on a hard wooden bench, it was the sound of her future rushing towards her, or her doom. She clutched a worn, creased letter, the paper softened by 100 anxious readings. The words promised a new life, a home, a husband named Mr. Bartholomew Higgins, a man of considerable means in a town called Promise Creek. She had traded the suffocating poverty of a Boston tenement for this one desperate gamble. She was a mail-order bride, a catalogue item chosen to fill a space. And as the train shuddered to a halt, she prayed she would be enough. The steam hissed from the locomotive, momentarily obscuring the raw wooden facade of the Promise Creek station. When it cleared, Juliet saw him. He was unmistakable, dressed precisely as his letters had described, a tailored tweed jacket, polished boots, and a stiff bowler hat that seemed entirely out of place under the enormous pale blue sky. Mr. Bartholomew Higgins was leaner than his photograph suggested, with a sharp, pointed nose and eyes so pale they looked like chips of ice. He stood with two other well-dressed men, his posture radiating an air of impatient ownership. Juliet took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of her plain grey wool dress for the 10th time, and descended the steep steps of the passenger car. The dress was her best mended and cleaned until her fingers were raw, but under the brilliant Montana sun, she knew it looked exactly what it was, the garment of a poor woman. Her worn valise containing everything she owned in the world felt as heavy as lead in her hand. She approached the trio, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Higgins," she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Bartholomew Higgins's gaze swept over her, a slow, deliberate appraisal that began at her scuffed shoes and ended on her hopeful, nervous face. It was a look one might give a horse before purchase, checking for flaws. A flicker of distaste crossed his thin lips. He didn't answer her directly, instead, turning to one of his companions. "Is this what the agency sent? Good Lord, what a specimen!" The words struck Juliet like a physical blow. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. She had known she wasn't a beauty. The hard years at the Boston orphanage, followed by grueling work in a textile mill, had stolen the bloom of youth early. But she was clean, decent, and hard-working. She had believed that would be enough. I am Juliet Miller," she said, forcing herself to stand straighter. "We have corresponded for 4 months, sir. You sent the ticket." Higgins finally deigned to look at her again. "I sent the ticket for the woman described in the catalogue, Miss Miller. A woman of modest but respectable means, with a wholesome country constitution. You," he sneered, gesturing vaguely at her person with a gloved hand, "look like you've just crawled out of a gutter. Your dress is patched. Your face is gaunt. Where is your dowry? The catalogue mentioned a small inheritance." The small inheritance had been a lie, a desperate embellishment by the overworked matchmaker at the agency, a $50 fib meant to secure a better match. The actual sum, her life savings, amounted to $6, and change tucked deep within her valise. "My circumstances are more modest than perhaps the agency portrayed," Juliet admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But my character is sound. I am an honest and diligent worker. I can keep a fine house, Mr. Higgins. I can cook and sew, and I have to doubt you can scrub floors." Higgins cut in his voice, dripping with condescension. "That is not what I require. I require a wife who will be a credit to my name. A hostess. A woman who can stand beside me at the governor's ball, not someone who looks like she should be serving the soup. You have no breeding, no grace. You are, in short, unsuitable. The public nature of the humiliation was a separate, twisting knife. The station platform was no longer empty. A few ranch hands, a family with small children, the station master, they were all watching. Their faces were a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Juliet felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her poverty, her rejection. What am I to do? She whispered, the enormity of her situation crashing down on her. She was thousands of miles from anything she knew, with no money and no one. Higgins gave a cold, dismissive shrug. That is no concern of mine. The Union Pacific runs east tomorrow morning. I suggest you find a way to be on it. I will not have you lingering in my town giving people the impression that I associate with your kind. He turned his back on her, as if she had ceased to exist, laughing at some comment one of his companions made. They moved off the platform toward a fine carriage, leaving her standing alone amidst the dust and stares. The world seemed to tilt. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Pride was the only thing she had left. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not give Bartholomew Higgins that satisfaction. She stood frozen, a statue of despair clutching her valise. The train whistle that had sounded of hope now echoing as a death knell in her ears. Across the dusty expanse of the station yard, a man leaned against a buckboard wagon laden with sacks of flour and feed. Samuel Dawson had been in town for supplies and had witnessed the entire brutal exchange. He wasn't a man who meddled. Life had taught him to keep his head down and focus on his own considerable struggles. But something in the woman's posture, the way her spine remained ramrod straight, even as her world crumbled, stirred a deep protective instinct he thought had died years ago. He knew Bart Higgins. Everyone knew him. A man who had inherited the largest, most prosperous ranch in the valley, the Higgins Holdings, and who treated the town of Promise Creek as his personal fiefdom. Higgins was cruel for sport, a man who measured his own height by how low he could make others stoop. Sam pushed himself off the wagon. He was not a handsome man in the way Higgins was polished. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused and scarred from rope and leather and steel. He wore simple denim trousers and a faded blue work shirt, clothes that spoke of labor, not leisure. He walked slowly, deliberately across the yard, his boots kicking up small puffs of ochre dust. He stopped a few feet from Juliet, not crowding her. He removed his worn Stetson hat, revealing a thick crop of unruly brown hair. His eyes were a startlingly kind shade of hazel, and they held none of the pity she'd seen in the other faces, only a quiet understanding. "Mum," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "Forgive my intrusion. I saw what happened. That was a low thing for a man to do." Juliet flinched, expecting more scorn. She looked at him, at his plain clothes and his kind eyes, and a single traitorous tear finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime of her journey. She wiped it away angrily. "I don't need your pity, sir." "It's not pity I'm offering," Sam said calmly. "It's a proposition. Of a sort." He gestured back toward his wagon. "My ranch is a half-day's ride from here. It's not much, just a small operation I run on my own. It's called Dawson's Hope. I could use a cook and someone to keep the house. It's hard work, and the pay is nothing more than room and board to start. But it's a roof over your head. It's decent, and it's a long way from that man." Juliet stared at him, suspicion warring with desperation. In her experience, men who offered kindness to women in her position rarely had honorable intentions. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "No, ma'am, I don't," he agreed. But I know Bart Higgins, and I know what it looks like when someone's been kicked when they're down. I ain't that man." He held her gaze, and there was an undeniable sincerity there, a simple decency that felt as real and solid as the mountains looming in the distance. "The offer's plain and simple. No strings. You work, you have a place to stay, until you can figure out what's next. It's better than spending the night on this platform." She looked from Sam's earnest, weathered face to the dust of the road where Higgins's fine carriage had disappeared. She had no other options. Her pride screamed at her to refuse to somehow survive on her own, but her practical mind knew that was a fantasy. She would be prey to far worse men than this one if she was left to fend for herself. Slowly she nodded. "All right, Mr. Dawson." "Samuel Dawson, but folks call me Sam." "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice firm again. "I accept your offer of employment. I am Juliet Miller, and I will earn my keep." Sam nodded, once a gesture of respect. "I have no doubt you will, Miss Miller." He reached down, and before she could protest, took her heavy valise from her hand. The simple act of him taking her burden felt monumental. "My wagon's over here. Let's get you away from this place." As she followed him, she risked one last glance at the people on the platform. Their expressions had changed again from pity to a new kind of speculation. She had been rejected by the richest man in the valley and rescued by a simple rancher. She didn't know it yet, but in the small, insular world of Promise Creek, the drama had only just begun. The journey to Dawson's Hope was conducted in a near-total suffocating silence. The rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the squeak of the wagon's axles were the only sounds punctuating the vast emptiness of the landscape. Juliet sat stiffly on the buckboard's bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sky was a startling, aggressive blue, so immense it felt like it could swallow a person whole. Rolling hills covered in dry golden grass stretched out in every direction, dotted with hardy sagebrush and the occasional lonely ponderosa pine. It was beautiful, she supposed, in a stark and intimidating way, but it felt alien. It was a world without walls, without the familiar press of a crowd, and she felt dangerously exposed. Samuel Dawson seemed comfortable in the silence. He handled the reins with an easy, practiced competence, his gaze sweeping the terrain with the familiarity of a man reading a beloved book. He didn't press her for conversation, for which she was profoundly grateful. Each mile they traveled put more distance between her and the humiliation on the train platform, but the scene replayed in her mind with vicious clarity. Higgins's sneer, the onlooker's stares, the feeling of being discarded like refuse. After what felt like an eternity, Sam pointed with his chin. "We're coming up on my land now." Juliet followed his gaze. The road dipped into a shallow valley, carved by a meandering creek, its banks lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering green against the gold of the hills. Tucked into a protective curve of the land was a small cluster of buildings. A simple, unpainted timber frame house, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of corrals. It was a far cry from the grand two-story mansion described in Higgins's letters. This place was humble functional, and looked as weathered and resilient as the man sitting beside her. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the endless sky. "It's not much," Sam said, a defensive edge to his voice, as if he expected her to be disappointed. "My father built the house. I added the new barn a few years back." "It's a home," Juliet said quietly, and the word felt foreign on her tongue. It was what she had craved, what she had traveled halfway across the country for. It was heartbreaking that she was arriving at one as a charity case, not as a bride. Sam pulled the wagon to a halt in the yard. the dust settling around them. He hopped down and tied the reins to a hitching post. "Well, let's get you settled." He led her to the house. The inside was sparse and overwhelmingly masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, which served as a kitchen dining room and living area all in one. A heavy wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A worn armchair sat by the hearth, a stack of almanacs, and a well-thumbed copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer on the small table beside it. The air smelled of wood-smoked coffee and leather. It was clean, but disorganized. Dishes were stacked by the wash basin, and a pile of mending a torn shirt, a pair of leather gloves, sat on a chair. "The place is yours to manage, Miss Miller," Sam said, setting her valise down. "There's a small bedroom through that door. It's empty now. It's got a proper bed and a dresser. The well is out back, pumps in good working order. I'll show you where the pantry and supplies are." He was all business, his tone polite but distant. He showed her the pantry stocked with flour beans, salt pork, and coffee. He pointed out the root cellar for storing potatoes and onions. He explained his routine up before dawn back after dusk. He ate a large meal in the evening and took leftovers for his midday meal. He was giving her the terms of her employment, but he was also drawing a clear line between them. He was her employer. She was his housekeeper. Nothing more. That first night was the longest of Juliet's life. After a simple meal of beans and bread, which they ate in that same uncomfortable silence, Sam retreated to the barn to check on a sick calf, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar house. The silence of the prairie pressed in on her. There were no sounds of neighbors through thin walls, no clatter of carts on cobblestones, no distant factory whistles. There was only the whisper of the wind through the grass and the mournful hoot of an owl. She stood in the small bedroom he had given her. It was plain, with a simple iron bedstead, a washstand, and a small window that looked out onto the dark rolling hills. It was also spotlessly clean, as if it had been waiting untouched for a long time. She opened her valise and took out her few possessions, a spare dress, a brush and comb set, and a small leather-bound Bible, her only inheritance from a mother she barely remembered. She felt the $6 in the bottom of the bag. It was a pathetic sum, not even enough for a train ticket a quarter of the way back to Boston. Mr. Dawson was right. She was trapped here. The despair she had held at bay all day threatened to overwhelm her. She sank onto the bed, buried her face in the rough quilt, and finally allowed herself to weep silent, racking sobs for her shattered hopes and the utter desolation of her circumstances. But Juliet was a survivor. Crying she knew solved nothing. When the tears subsided, a cold, hard resolve settled in their place. She had been given a reprieve, a sanctuary, however fragile. She would not waste it. She would prove her worth. She would not be a burden. She would make herself so useful, so indispensable that Mr. Samuel Dawson would never regret his moment of kindness. The next morning she was up before him. When Sam entered the house from the barn, the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee met him at the door. A fire was crackling cheerfully in the hearth. Juliet was standing at the stove frying salt pork in a cast-iron skillet. The dirty dishes from the night before were washed and stacked neatly on a shelf. He stopped, surprised. "Miss Miller, you're up early." "It is my job to be Mr. Dawson," she replied without turning around. "Breakfast will be ready in a moment." Her tone was formal, professional. It re-established the boundary he had drawn, but it also held a note of unassailable competence. They ate in silence again, but this time it felt different. It was the quiet of two people focused on the day ahead, not the awkward silence of strangers. As the days turned into a week, Juliet transformed the small house. She found a rhythm in the chores, a purpose in the work. She scrubbed the floors until the wood planks shone. She washed the windows, letting in the bright Montana light. She tackled the pile of mending her stitches, small and neat. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch out behind the house and began to weed and water it, coaxing life back into the parched soil. And she began to notice things about her silent employer. She saw the way his shoulders slumped with exhaustion when he came in at night. She saw the stack of unopened letters and bills on the mantelpiece gathering dust. One evening while tidying, she picked up a ledger book that was lying open on the table. It was a mess of scrawled numbers and unpaid invoices. He was good at ranching, she surmised, but not at business. She hesitated for a day, worried about overstepping her bounds. But the sight of another final notice from the Promise Creek Mercantile decided her. That evening, after they had finished their meal, she cleared her throat. "Mr. Dawson," she began, her voice steady. "I hope you will not think me presumptuous." He looked up from cleaning his rifle, his expression wary. "What is it, Miss Miller?" "At the mill in Boston, I worked for a time in the foreman's office. I have a good head for numbers and I write a clear hand," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I have noticed your ledgers and accounts seem to be a burden on your time. If you would permit me, I could organize them for you, put them in order. It is part of keeping a house, is it not? A house must be in financial order, as well as physical." Sam stared at her, his hazel eyes unreadable. He was a proud man and fiercely private. The idea of this woman, this stranger, sifting through his financial struggles was deeply unsettling. He was about to refuse to tell her to mind her own business, but then he looked at the neat, orderly house around him. He thought of the pile of papers that gave him a headache every time he looked at it. He saw the earnest, determined look on her face. She wasn't asking to be nosy. She was offering a solution to a problem she had correctly identified. He let out a slow breath and nodded. "All right, Miss Miller. If you think you can make sense of that mess, you're welcome to try." It was a test, and Juliet knew it. For the next 3 days, she dedicated her afternoons to the task. She sorted invoices, recorded expenses, and balanced columns of figures. She discovered he was owed money by several smaller outfits for stud fees from his prize bull payments he had never pursued. She found he was paying far too much for feed because he was buying it in small, regular quantities instead of in bulk. With meticulous care, she created a new, clean ledger, her elegant script a stark contrast to his rough scrawl. She drafted polite but firm letters to those who owed him money. When she was finished, she presented the new ledger to him. "Your accounts are in order, Mr. Dawson. I have also taken the liberty of drafting some letters regarding outstanding payments. They are on the mantel for your review and signature." Sam took the book and flipped through the pages. He saw the neat columns, the clear accounting, the summary page that showed him for the first time in years exactly where he stood. He was still struggling, but the situation wasn't as hopeless as he had feared. He looked at the letters. They were perfectly worded, respectful, but firm. He looked at Juliet, who was watching him with a quiet, expectant expression. For the first time since she had arrived, a slow, genuine smile spread across Samuel Dawson's face. It transformed his stern features, making him look younger, less burdened. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice holding a new warmth. "Juliet, you have a remarkable gift." It was more than just praise for her bookkeeping. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. In that moment, the line between employer and housekeeper began to blur, replaced by the first tentative foundations of a partnership. But just as a fragile sense of peace began to settle over Dawson's hope, a visitor arrived from Promise Creek, bringing with him a warning that their newfound tranquility was about to be shattered. Sheriff Brody rode into the yard, his face grim, and the dust his horse kicked up carried the scent of trouble. Sheriff Brody was a man whose considerable bulk was matched only by his formidable reputation for fairness. He had a walrus mustache that obscured his mouth and tired, knowing eyes that had seen too much of the petty cruelties and grand tragedies the West had to offer. He dismounted with a weary sigh and accepted the cup of water Juliet offered him, nodding his thanks. "Sam," he said, getting straight to the point, "I've come out here as a courtesy. Folks are talking." Sam leaned against a porch post, his arms crossed, his expression hardening. "Talking about what Walter, about you, and about her," Brody said, gesturing with his head toward Juliet, who had discreetly moved to stand by the door. "Specifically about her being here with you after being sent for by Bart Higgins." "She's my housekeeper," Sam stated flatly. "It's a respectable arrangement." "I know that. You know that." The sheriff sighed, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "But you know how Higgins operates. He's putting the word out that he turned her away because she was of ill repute. Says he discovered she was a woman of loose morals, a thief chased out of Boston. He's painting her as sullied goods that only a desperate man like you would take in." Juliet gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The lies were so vicious, so baseless that they stole her breath. She felt the shame of the train platform wash over her again, now poisoned with a far more sinister venom. Sam's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "He's a liar." "Of course he is," Brody agreed. "But Bart owns the mercantile, the saloon, and the bank. People in this town depend on his goodwill. They'll listen to his poison, or they'll pretend to. He's humiliated that she stayed, and more than that she stayed with you, his neighbor. It makes him look like a fool. A man like that can't abide being made a fool. He's going to make you both pay. I'm just telling you to watch your back." The sheriff's warning hung in the air long after he had ridden away. The sanctuary of Dawson's hope suddenly felt vulnerable, like a tiny island in a sea of malice. Juliet felt a crushing weight of guilt. "Mr. Dawson, Sam, this is my fault. I have brought this trouble to your door. Perhaps it would be best if I left." "And go where?" Sam asked, his voice rough with an anger directed not at her, but at Higgins. "Back to the station. Let him win." "No." He turned to face her, his hazel eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness. "This is your home for as long as you want it, Juliet. We don't run from bullies and we don't bow to lies. We stand our ground." His declaration was a shield, and she felt a profound, aching gratitude. He was defending her honor when he had no obligation to do so. In that moment, something shifted between them again, solidifying into an unspoken alliance against the world. The truth of Sheriff Brody's warning became apparent on their next trip to Promise Creek for supplies. As Juliet walked toward the mercantile women who had previously offered hesitant smiles, now turned away, busying themselves with items on a shelf or crossing the street to avoid her. Two men loafing on the saloon porch snickered as she passed one, making a crude comment just loud enough for her to hear. Each averted gaze, each whispered comment was a small sting. But not everyone was hostile. As Juliet stood at the counter, her face set in a mask of stoicism, a warm hand touched her arm. It was Martha Brody, the sheriff's wife, a kind-faced woman with flour dust on her apron. "Don't you pay them any mind, dear," Martha said in a low, conspiratorial voice. "They're just chickens afraid of the fox. Bartholomew Higgins may own half this town, but he doesn't own its soul. Not all of it, anyway." She squeezed Juliet's arm. "You come by the house for tea one of these afternoons. We'll show them what real society looks like." The small act of kindness was a balm to Juliet's wounded spirit. It was a reminder that even in the face of widespread animosity, decency could still be found. Back at the ranch, a more insidious problem began to manifest. The creek that flowed through Sam's land, the lifeblood of his small herd of cattle, was shrinking. Every day the water level dropped, the gentle flow slowing to a sluggish trickle. The cottonwoods on its banks began to look thirsty, their leaves curling at the edges. "It's Higgins," Sam said one evening, his face grim as he stared at the muddy creek bed. "His land is upstream from mine. The main spring that feeds this creek is on his property. He must have dammed it or diverted it." "Can he do that?" Juliet asked, her heart sinking. Water was everything in this land. Without it, the cattle would die, the ranch would fail. According to the law, he's supposed to allow a fair portion to flow downstream to neighboring properties, Sam explained, kicking at a dry rock. But proving he's deliberately stopping it is another matter. It would take lawyers and money, two things I don't have. The threat was no longer just about rumors and social standing. It was existential. Higgins was trying to choke them out, to bankrupt Sam and force him off his land, all as a petty act of revenge. The desperation Sam had been holding at bay for years began to creep back into his eyes. Juliet could not stand to see it. She refused to be a passive victim in the destruction of the man who had saved her. While he spent his days hauling barrels of water from the well to keep the cattle alive, an exhausting, unsustainable task, she returned to the one weapon she possessed, her intellect and her meticulous nature. She turned the house upside down, searching through the dusty trunk that held Sam's father's belongings. She was looking for anything, an old letter, a map, a forgotten agreement. In the bottom of the trunk, beneath moth-eaten wool blankets and a set of surveyor's tools, she found a long tin cylinder. Inside, protected from the elements, was the original land deed for the Dawson property, signed in 1868, complete with a hand-drawn survey map. She spent hours poring over the faded ink, the elegant looping script, a stark contrast to the urgent reality they faced. She read every clause, every description of the property's borders marked by ancient trees and rock formations. It was a window into the past, a time when the land was wilder, the promises greater. Her growing presence on the ranch had softened Sam in ways he hadn't anticipated. The house was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a home, filled with the smell of baking bread and the sight of her bent over his ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration. He found himself looking forward to the evenings, to their quiet meals that were no longer silent, but filled with talk of the day's work and her discoveries in the garden. One afternoon, he found her struggling to mend a section of broken fence near the house. He came up behind her and gently took the hammer from her hand. "Here, let me show you. You want to drive the staple in at an angle. See bites into the wood better." He stood close, his hand guiding hers. She was acutely aware of his warmth, the calloused texture of his fingers against her own, the scent of sun and leather and clean sweat. It was an innocent gesture, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with hammering nails. She looked up at him, and for a long moment their eyes met and held. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy, a current of attraction that had been building quietly beneath the surface of their practical arrangement. Sam cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. "Just like that," he said, his voice a little husky. That evening the conversation felt different, more personal. He found himself telling her about his late wife Mary and their infant son, who had been taken by a fever 6 years prior. He spoke of the suffocating grief that had followed the emptiness of the house, the reason he had thrown himself into work, and shut out the world. This place wasn't Dawson's hope, then, he said quietly, staring into the fire. It was just a place to survive. The hope was gone. Juliet listened, her heart aching for him. And she in turn told him more about her own life. Not the curated version from the mail-order catalogue, but the truth. The cold, impersonal charity of the orphanage, the constant hunger, the fear of being cast out onto the street. She spoke of her desperate dream of having a place, any place that was truly hers. They were two lonely, wounded souls finding solace in their shared vulnerability. The walls between them had crumbled, completely replaced by a deep, tender empathy. The fragile peace was shattered a few days later. Higgins, impatient with the slow progress of his water-based strangulation, escalated his campaign. Two of his ranch hands, rough men with cruel smirks, rode onto Sam's property while he was out checking on the herd. They found Juliet tending her garden. "Well, look what we have here," one of them drawled, dismounting from his horse. "Higgins's little cast-off playin' house." "You are trespassing," Juliet said, her voice shaking but firm as she gripped her gardening trowel like a weapon. "Leave now." The man laughed. "We'll leave when we're good and ready. We just came to deliver a message from Mr. Higgins. He says this land is getting awful dry. A fire would spread real fast out here. A real shame it would be if this little house of yours went up in smoke." It was a direct, terrifying threat. As if to punctuate it, the other man deliberately rode his horse through her carefully tended vegetable patch, trampling the young plants under its hooves. They were laughing as they rode away, leaving Juliet standing amidst the wreckage of her garden, her body trembling with fear and rage. When Sam returned and saw what had happened, a cold, dangerous fury settled in his eyes. He checked that she was unharmed, his hands gentle on her arms, his relief palpable. But the gentleness was gone from his face, replaced by a grim resolve. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and hard. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the worn armchair by the cold hearth, his shotgun across his lap, watching the dark horizon for the first flicker of a malicious flame. Higgins had made his move, and Sam knew a confrontation was now inevitable. The only question was what form it would take and whether they could possibly survive it. The days that followed the threat were taut with a constant simmering anxiety. The drought, both natural and man-made, held the valley in its grip. The grass in Sam's pastures turned a brittle, sickly yellow. His cattle grew thin, their ribs showing their lowing calls, sounding weak and plaintive. Every morning, Sam hitched the team to the wagon and began the back-breaking, heart-breaking work of hauling water from the well to the troughs, a desperate finger-in-the-dike effort against a tide of ruin. He grew leaner, his face etched with deeper lines of exhaustion and worry. Juliet watched him, her heart aching with a feeling of helplessness. Her trampled garden was a constant, bitter reminder of Higgins's cruelty and their own vulnerability. The fear of fire was a living thing, a phantom that danced in the heat haze on the horizon and made every snap of a twig in the night sound like an approaching arsonist. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a partner in this struggle, her fate inextricably tied to the fate of this land and the man who was fighting so hard to save it. She refused to surrender to despair. While Sam toiled under the merciless sun, she returned to her own battlefield, the dusty papers and faded maps. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was there, hidden in the cryptic legal language of the past. The original deed was her gospel. She read it over and over, tracing the property lines with her finger, memorizing the archaic terms for boundaries and rights. It was the mention of all appurtenant water rights, recorded and unrecorded, that snagged her attention. It was a standard phrase, but it felt significant. She knew she needed more. A single deed was not enough. She needed context, a map that showed not just Sam's land, but the entire region, as it was when the deed was written. Martha Brodie's offer of tea became her opportunity. On the pretext of a social visit, Juliet rode the gentlest of Sam's horses into Promise Creek, her mind racing. Martha welcomed her with genuine warmth, offering her sweet tea and slices of pound cake in her cool, clean kitchen. After a suitable interval of polite conversation, Juliet broached the subject that consumed her. "Martha," she began, "you and the sheriff have lived here a long time. You know the history of this place." "Long enough to see fools come and go," Martha said wryly, "and rich fools are the most persistent kind. I have been studying Mr. Dawson's original land deed." Juliet continued, her voice low. "I need to see an older county survey map, one from around the 1860s or 70s. Do you know if one might exist in the town records?" Martha's eyes lit up with interest. "The county records office is just a dusty room in the back of the courthouse. Walter keeps the key. Most folks have forgotten it's even there. But there are maps, all right. Stacks of them. What are you looking for, child?" "A second chance." Juliet said, a flicker of hope igniting within her. A forgotten promise. With Martha's quiet intervention, Sheriff Brodie, intrigued by her tenacity, unlocked the door to the records office. It was a small, stuffy room smelling of dry paper and time itself. Rolled maps and thick, leather-bound ledgers were crammed onto shelves, coated in a fine layer of dust. For 2 full afternoons, while Sam thought she was visiting with Martha, Juliet worked in that forgotten room. She carefully unrolled brittle maps, her fingers gentle her eyes, scanning for the familiar shape of the Dawson and Higgins properties. Finally, she found it. It was a detailed topographical survey of the valley from 1871, commissioned by the territorial government. And on it she saw the answer. Her heart began to pound. The main creek the one Higgins had dammed was clearly marked, but the map also showed another smaller line, drawn in fainter ink. It originated from a different location on what was now Higgins's land, a spot marked with the symbol for a spring, labelled Coulter's Spring. This second smaller waterway flowed on a different course, joining the main creek much farther down, well within the boundaries of Sam's property. Cross-referencing it with the legal description in the deed, she found the correlating passage, including sole and exclusive access to the waters of the secondary channel, originating at Coulter's Spring, by permanent and unbreakable easement for the purpose of watering stock. It was a legal right-of-way. An easement. A forgotten clause from a time when the properties were configured differently, a right that had been passed down with the land itself. Coulter's Spring had likely dwindled over the years, or been overgrown, forgotten by subsequent generations, including Sam's father, but the legal right to its water remained unbreakable, written into the very DNA of the land's title. She practically flew back to the ranch, the rolled-up copy of the map clutched in her hand like a holy relic. She found Sam by the barn, his shoulders slumped in defeat. One of his cows, a young heifer, had collapsed from dehydration, and he hadn't been able to get her back up. "Sam," she cried, breathless, waving the map. "I've found it. We have a right, a different spring." He looked at her, his face a mask of weary disbelief. But as she spread the map on the ground, weighting its corners with rocks, and traced the lines with a trembling finger, explaining her discovery, his exhaustion began to recede, replaced by a dawning, incredulous hope. Coulter's Spring. He breathed the name, a distant echo from his childhood. "My grandfather used to talk about it. Said it dried up years ago." "Perhaps it didn't dry up," Juliet said, her eyes shining with fierce conviction. "Perhaps it was just forgotten, or hidden. Sam the Right is here, in black and white. He can't stop us from using it. It's ours, The next morning they rode out together, not with shovels and buckets, but with the deed, the map, and a renewed sense of purpose. They followed the faint trail indicated on the old survey, pushing through thickets of overgrown chokecherry and thorny buffalo berry bushes. After an hour of searching, they found it. Tucked away in a small rocky canyon, hidden by a dense growth of willows, was a pool of clear, cold water bubbling up from the earth. The spring was weak, its channel blocked by decades of fallen rocks and debris, but it was flowing. It was real. A grin, the first genuine, joyful grin she had ever seen on his face, split Sam's features. He let out a whoop of triumph that echoed off the canyon walls. He grabbed Juliet by the waist and swung her around in a circle, and she laughed, a pure, unburdened sound of victory. When he set her down, they were both breathless, their faces close. The moment was charged with more than just relief. It was the culmination of their shared struggle, a bond forged in adversity. He didn't kiss her, but the promise of one hung in the air between them, more powerful than any physical touch. Their victory, however, required one final, dangerous step confrontation. They rode not to Higgins's grand house, but straight into Promise Creek, to the office of Sheriff Brody. They laid the deed and the map on his desk. The sheriff, a man who respected the law above all else, studied the documents, his mustache twitching as he read. "Well, I'll be," he said, finally looking up. "A permanent easement, clear as day. Bart's not going to like this." "He doesn't have to like it," Sam said, his voice hard as iron. "He just has to abide by it. Will you ride out with me, Walter, as a witness to the law?" Brody nodded slowly, a glint of satisfaction in his tired eyes. "It would be my pleasure, Sam." The three of them, Sam strong and resolute, Juliet her quiet determination, a palpable force, and Sheriff Brody, the embodiment of the law, rode to Higgins Holdings. They found Bartholomew Higgins on the veranda of his opulent two-story house, sipping lemonade. He looked up at their approach, an arrogant, dismissive smirk on his face. "Dawson," he sneered. "Have you come to beg for a few barrels of water, or perhaps you're finally returning my defective property?" He cast a contemptuous glance at Juliet. "I've come to claim what's mine, Higgins." Sam said, his voice calm and even. He dismounted and held up the documents. "This is the original deed to my land, and this is a territorial survey map from 1871. I believe you're familiar with the concept of a permanent water easement, specifically the one for Coulter's Spring, which originates on your land." Higgins's smirk faltered. He snatched the papers from Sam's hand, his eyes scanning them frantically. The color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy, furious red. This is an absurdity. A forgotten relic. That spring is nothing." "It's enough," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "And the law is the law, Bart. The easement is valid. Sam and his housekeeper have the right to clear the channel and draw their legal portion of the water. And if you interfere in any way, I'll arrest you for obstruction and have you in a federal jail before sunset." The threat of federal intervention was real. Higgins was a big fish in the small pond of Promise Creek, but even he was subject to territorial law. He was trapped. The complex legal web he thought protected his power had been used against him, and the instrument of his defeat was not a powerful man, but a piece of old paper unearthed by the very woman he had scorned and declared worthless. He stared at Juliet, his icy eyes filled with a new venomous hatred. All his life he had built his identity on a foundation of wealth and superiority, a desperate attempt to outrun the shadow of his own family's financial ruin back east, a secret the whole town suspected but never spoke of. He saw his control, his carefully constructed reputation, crumbling before his very eyes. "You!" he hissed at her, his voice shaking with rage. "You did this, you worthless gutter-bred." "That's enough, Bart." Sam's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. He had moved to stand slightly in front of Juliet, a human shield. "The woman you threw away just saved the man you tried to ruin. You may have the bigger ranch, but you're the poorest man I've ever met." The words hit Higgins harder than any physical blow. They struck at the core of his deepest fear. With a strangled cry of pure frustration and impotence, he tore the copied map to shreds and threw the pieces to the ground. He was defeated not by guns or fists, but by the truth and by the resilience of two people he had grossly underestimated. He turned and stormed back into his grand empty house, slamming the door behind him, a prisoner in his own palace of spite. As they rode away, the afternoon sun casting long shadows behind them, Juliet looked at Sam. The struggle was over. They had won. The water would flow again, and Dawson's hope would survive. But what had been born between them in the midst of that struggle was something far more powerful and enduring than a simple creak. It was a partnership, a respect, and a deep, unspoken love, waiting only for the right moment to finally be given a voice. In the weeks that followed, life at Dawson's, hope transformed. With the channel from Coulter's spring cleared, fresh life-giving water flowed through the land once more. The pastures began to recover their green luster, and the cattle grew strong again. The shadow of Bartholomew Higgins receded his public humiliation, leaving him isolated, and his power in Promise Creek diminished. But the biggest change was inside the small timber frame house. The silence was gone, replaced by easy conversation and shared laughter. One evening as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Sam turned to Juliet on the porch. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "Juliet," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "You came here as a mail-order bride, looking for a home. I wasn't the man you were promised, and this wasn't the life you expected. But you saved this ranch. You saved me. This place is only Dawson's hope, because you brought hope back into it. I'm not offering you a job anymore. I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, in everything." Tears welled in Juliet's eyes as she looked at the kind, steady man before her, her heart full. This was not a contract based on a catalogue. This was a proposal forged in respect, courage, and a love that had bloomed in the most arid of soils. "Yes, Sam," she whispered. "Yes. If this story of resilience, unexpected love, and triumph over cruelty touched your heart, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share it with someone who loves a good old-fashioned tale of the West. And most importantly, if you want to hear more stories, like the journey of Juliet and Sam, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter we have to share. Thank you for listening.